In 1935, US Army General Billy Mitchell said that Alaska was the most important strategic place in the world. And yet, the battles which took place there during the Second World War tend to go under the radar. Between June 1942 and August 1943, US forces fought the Japanese in the Aleutian Islands, with the Japanese occupying Kiska and Attu. In this video, we're gonna shed some light on the Battle of Attu, in which Allied forces faced one of the biggest Japanese Banzai attacks of the entire war. By May 1942, US naval intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes and learnt that a Japanese naval fleet led by Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogawa was headed for Alaska. Within Hosogawa's fleet were 2 aircraft carriers, 5 cruisers, 12 destroyers, 6 submarines, 4 troop transports, and a number of supporting vessels. In response, US forces in the area swelled. By June, 45,000 military personnel were stationed in Alaska, covered by the USAAF's 11th Air Force in the air and Task Force 8 in the sea. Hoping to eliminate Hosogawa before he reached the shore, the 11th sent out reconnaissance planes. Once they spotted Hosogawa, they would direct Task Force 8 so it could meet the Japanese Vice Admiral in the sea. But due to poor weather, this naval confrontation never came to pass, and on the 3rd of June, it was Hosogawa who landed the first punch. And it was a flaccid first punch indeed, as only half of Hosogawa's bombers reached their objective, the naval base at Dutch Harbour on Amaknak Island. The rest became lost in the fog, obscuring their approach, and either returned to their carriers or crashed. Those bombers that did make it through the fog faced heavy anti-aircraft fire and ultimately did little damage to the harbour. A second attack the next day saw more success, with Hosogawa's bombers hitting the base's barracks, oil storage tanks, and hospital. The Vice Admiral had intended to follow these raids with an invasion of the island of Adak, but once again, the weather stood against him, forcing him to look elsewhere in the Aleutian Islands for a place to deposit his troops. On the 6th, 500 personnel of the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces landed on the island of Kiska. Just 10 US Navy personnel were there to defend it. Storming the weather station, the Japanese killed 2 of these men and captured 7. 1 man got away. The following day, the Japanese landed on Attu, and 1,140 men under Major Matsutoshi Hosumi took the island virtually unopposed, capturing 46 civilians and killing 1. Now that Hosogawa had secured 2 footholds in Alaska, fear spread throughout the US. According to Lieutenant Bob Brocklehurst of the US 18th Fighter Squadron, "We figured that the Japanese, if they wanted to, could have come up the Aleutians, taken Anchorage, and come down past Vancouver to Seattle, Washington." In response, the US set up an airbase on Adak and started bombing the Japanese on Kiska, softening Hosogawa's defenses in preparation for an eventual American invasion. Hosogawa answered by relocating his forces from Attu to Kiska in August, leaving Attu unoccupied until October, when some 2,900 men under one Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki rocked up to once again secure the island. Yamasaki immediately got to work fortifying Attu and building an airfield in anticipation of an American invasion. Codenamed Operation Land Crab, said invasion began on the 11th of May 1943. Brought to bear against Yamasaki were some 15,000 men of US Major General Albert Brown's 7th Infantry Division, to which the 1st Alaskan Combat Intelligence Platoon, nicknamed Kastner's Cutthroats, was attached. Despite a numerical advantage, the Battle of Attu was no walk in the park for the Americans. They weren't just facing the Japanese, but the island itself. In the introduction of The Capture of Attu, author Gregory J.W. Irwin described the island as such: a jumble of sheer snow-capped peaks, barren volleys of brown tundra, and narrow beaches. Attu hardly seems the kind of place for which sensible men would give their lives. Irwin also went on to quote the New York Times military editor and analyst Henson W. Baldwin, who had the following to say about Attu: "Sudden fierce squalls rage around the island. Fog is always prevalent, and the clinging white mist is so thick that soldiers advancing across the rocky hills lose sight of each other. The supporting fire of naval vessels cannot be observed. Planes cannot bomb." To truly understand the conditions the men faced, however, we have to join them in their foxholes, just as United Press correspondent Russell Annabelle did. In Annabelle's words, "Under the cover of fog and darkness, you would dig a foxhole and put up a breastwork of cut sodden rocks. You were already wet from fording streams and falling into sinkholes, and now you were standing in a foot or more of bitterly cold water. You couldn't search for a drier place, because by this time, the Jap snipers and mortar crews had spotted you." Of course, the Japanese had had more time to adapt to the hell that was Attu than the Americans, digging a network of underground tunnels and chambers in which they could keep themselves dry, and setting up camouflage machine gun and sniper positions in the mountains, turning the mountain passes they knew the Americans would need to use into kill zones. The Japanese were better dressed for the occasion too, donning fur-lined clothes and woven mittens. From the 11th to the 16th of May, Major General Brown's morale plummeted. He simply could not break Yamasaki's defense in the aptly named Massacre Valley, just inland from the US Southern Landing Force's landing place at Massacre Bay. On the 14th, Brown reported the following: "The Japanese positions are difficult to locate and almost impossible to shoot out with artillery. They produce casualties in excess of casualties which can be returned. Progress through mountain passes will require troops in excess to those now available to my command." On the 16th, Brown was cut loose. General Eugene M. Landrum replaced him, and he must have been a far more competent commander because he quickly broke the stalemate. From that point forward, despite the frostbite blackening the American soldiers' toes, Yamasaki was out of his depth. The US North Landing Force marched inland and, joining the Southern Landing Force, drove the Japanese northeast toward Chichagof Harbor. Now, Yamasaki's situation was looking desperate. Naval reinforcements promised to him were no longer coming. Mainland Japan had abandoned the poor man, and victory was all but impossible. All that he could do now was keep his honor by fighting to the death or ending his own life. On the 29th of May, Yamasaki gathered as many as 1,000 survivors and launched a massive Banzai attack against the Americans. In the lead up to the attack, Nebsi Tatsukuchi, who served in the Japanese North Sea Defense Field Hospital, penned the following in his diary: "Today, we assembled in front of HQs. The field hospital took part 2. The last assault is to be carried out. All the patients in the hospital were to commit suicide. Only 33 years of living, and I am to die here. I have no regrets. Banzai to the Emperor." During the attack, the Japanese overran 2 US command posts and a US medical station, engaging the Americans in ferocious close-quarters combat. But they were always destined to fail, and most of those who didn't fall to American bullets fell on their own blades or committed suicide by other means. The US correspondent, Robert Sherrod, described the carnage like this: "The results of the Jap fanaticism stagger the imagination. It is incomprehensible to the Western mind. I saw one Jap sitting impaled on a bayonet which was stuck through his back, evidently by a friend. Most of them had simply held grenades against their stomachs or chests. Probably 1 in 4 held a grenade against his head. There were many headless Jap bodies between Massacre Bay and Chichagof. From the 11th to the 30th of May, 2,872 Japanese either committed suicide or were killed by American forces, including Yamasaki. The remaining 28, remember their starting strength was 2,900, were taken as POWs. On the American side, 549 men were killed, while 1,148 were wounded and 1,814 became sick, with some of the latter dying as a result. Author Samuel Eliot Morison wrote that both the Japanese and Americans would have done well to have left the Aleutians to the Aleuts for the course of the war. Do you agree with Morison? Definitely wasn't worth it for the Japanese, but what about the Americans? Was victory in the Battle of Attu worth all that American blood? What about the Aleutian Islands campaign overall? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.